Hello there! My name is Justin Clumpner and I'm a painting teacher over at Rockwall High School. Today I'm going to give you a brief history of painting. We're going to start at the Renaissance and shoot all the way through to 1950s America. It's a lot to cover. So without further ado, this is a brief history of painting. First, painting is as old as humanity. Every known civilization found a way to use pigment to create imagery. You could spend a lifetime examining the artistic output of any region. We're going to spend more time looking at the painting traditions developed in Europe because they are the traditions that most heavily influence American art. But many European traditions were heavily influenced by ideas learned from other cultures. For instance, we're going to start today by talking about Florence during the Renaissance. A lot of the work created in Florence was only possible due to the wealth created by Italy's trade with the Middle East. If it wasn't for the rich red vermilion developed in China or ultramarine blue developed by Persians in Afghanistan, many of the richly colored paintings of the Renaissance wouldn't have been possible. Of course, one of the most well-known paintings of the Renaissance is the Mona Lisa. This painting became an instant icon when it was painted by Leonardo da Vinci in 1503, and it cemented his reputation as the greatest artist in Florence. It was considered so beautiful and realistic that it was found referenced in Florentine love letters. "My dear, not even the great Leonardo could capture your beauty," and stuff like that. Leonardo kept the painting with him until his death in France when he was hanging out with the French king, so now it's housed in the Louvre in Paris. It was actually stolen in 1911 and taken back to Italy, but recovered in 1913 and returned to France. Oddly enough, Pablo Picasso was a suspect in that robbery and brought in for questioning by French authorities. In 1956, it was damaged when some guy threw acid on it. Later that year, somebody damaged it again by throwing a rock at it. It's had a lot of incidences, so now it's behind bulletproof glass. Another well-known painting from the Renaissance was the Sistine Chapel ceiling, painted by Michelangelo. It's a 12,000 square foot painting commissioned by Pope Julius II for his personal chapel. It was painted between 1508 and 1512. The painting is a fresco, meaning the paint was applied to wet plaster to lock in the color. Michelangelo wanted nothing to do with the ceiling. He tried to turn down the Pope as he considered himself more of a sculptor, and he had no experience whatsoever with frescoes, so Michelangelo wrote often about how much he hated painting this ceiling, saying that his spine's all knotted from folding myself over, and I'm not in the right place. I am not a painter.
I will not obey you! Will not! Did I hear you correctly? Will not? Yes. I'll destroy it first, with my own hands.
Pretty good for your first fresco, huh? On the highest section, Michelangelo painted 9 stories from the book of Genesis. He was originally commissioned to paint only 12 figures, the apostles. But in order to get Michelangelo to take the commission, the Pope offered to allow him to paint whatever biblical scenes he wanted. And by the time Michelangelo finished, there were more than 300 figures, which included scenes of God creating the world, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and Noah and the flood. So, the painting ideas seen in the Renaissance spread throughout Europe and are institutionalized. In France, this was the result of the Salon. Beginning in 1667, the Salon was the official art exhibit of the Académie des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Between 1748 and 1890 was arguably the greatest annual art event in the Western world. The Salon exhibited paintings floor to ceiling and on every available inch of space. It was one of the only places an artist could have their work exhibited in Paris at that time. So if you didn't get your work into the Salon, it was very difficult to make a living as an artist. This meant the Salon judges got to determine what art should look like. They preferred realistic styles of painting and developed a hierarchy as to what the subject matter of a good painting should be. Paintings of historical scenes or allegories were considered the best, followed by portraits of important people. Then John Racine's landscapes and still lifes were considered low art, not very valuable. This went on for a while. And then modernism comes in. It wasn't until Manet and the Impressionists came along that painting really began to change. Inspired by Japanese prints, the Impressionists started exploring genre scenes of everyday contemporary life and the effects of light and color on the world. This was considered highly offensive and controversial by many and was often ridiculed for looking hasty and unfinished. But the use of color by the Impressionists was so bold and exciting that it captivated people for over a century, and still captivates today. The Impressionists were followed by the Post-Impressionists, obviously. Artists like Vincent van Gogh and Henri Toulouse-Lautrec were influenced by some of the theatrical elements in Japanese prints depicting kabuki theater and the colors and floral designs in Chinese pottery. They brought those colors and expressive styles and mixed it with the language of European painting to express the emotional and psychological.
It's impossible. It's impossible.
After that, Henri Matisse and Pablo Picasso pick up where they left off to bring in design elements and ideas from Africa into European painting to develop Fauvism and Cubism. This was intended to make painting more approachable to the newly forming French middle class that aren't interested in the giant history paintings of the Salon and want something more avant-garde, which means new and unusual or experimental ideas. These artists filled their works with new ideas as to how people and spaces could be depicted and how colors could be used. After Matisse and Picasso, things get real complicated. So much so that it's impossible to compress into this lecture. But a lot of scholars see Picasso and Matisse as a launching point for everything that comes after. Here are some of the artists following Matisse's lead. They move away from realistic depictions with him and exhibit together, and are repeatedly criticized for their unrestrained colors. One critic, upon seeing one of these exhibitions, responded, "A pot of paint thrown in the face of the public," and called him and his followers Fauvists. That's French for wild beasts. Critics were basically saying Matisse and his followers painted like animals. Now, Pablo Picasso goes on to become one of the most famous names in Western art history. There are very few people in the world that haven't heard the name Picasso. So who was he? Well, Picasso was a child prodigy from Spain. He had become a master of drawing and painting at an incredibly young age. Picasso's father, a longtime artist and teacher, stated that at age 15 his son had surpassed him, and he would therefore give up painting. Here you can see the drawings and paintings of 15-year-old Picasso. Picasso then moves to Paris to continue his artistic development and lives as a poor bohemian artist. In 1901, depressed over the suicide of a close friend, Picasso launched into the austere, melancholic paintings of his Blue period. Life and The Old Guitarist are the best-known paintings of this period. Desperately poor, he restricted his palette to predominantly cold colors suggestive of night, misery, dreams, and death. Picasso goes on to develop Cubism with the help of Georges Braque, who was a Fauvist and follower of Matisse. It is upon seeing Braque's paintings in 1908 that Matisse stated, "They're made of little cubes." A critic overheard this and wrote about it, calling the work Cubism, and the name stuck ever since. This wasn't the last time Cubism was misunderstood. Picasso once said, "The fact that for a long time Cubism has not been understood, and that even today there are people who cannot see anything in it, means nothing. I do not read English, and an English book is a blank to me. This does not mean that the English language doesn't exist. And why should I blame anyone but myself if I cannot understand what I know nothing about?" It's a pretty fancy way of calling people boneheads. Anyway, these two artists are important to discuss because it's hard to find a contemporary painter that isn't in some way influenced by them. David Hockney, one of England's most renowned contemporary painters, is still heavily influenced by the work of Picasso and Matisse. Chuck Close, one of America's most noted contemporary portrait artists, wouldn't exist without the innovations of Matisse and Picasso. And the layered collage paintings of Mark Bradford are a descendant of the collage and cut paperworks of Matisse and Picasso. In fact, a quick stroll through Instagram will show the ideas of Matisse and Picasso are still very much being explored by painters today. Cubism opens the door to the embrace of abstraction by artists like Wassily Kandinsky and Marcel Duchamp, seen here. And that opens the door for abstract expressionism, which is inspired by Mexican muralists and Navajo sand paintings. By looking at new ways to apply paint, artists like Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko are exploring new but old ways of how a painting can be made. Now we have to acknowledge that Jackson Pollock was dependent on the intellectual support and artistic inspiration of his wife and fellow artist Lee Krasner. She was arguably a better painter, but the misogynist art world wasn't ready to accept that in the 1950s. So, that's the abridged history of painting. I oversimplified something much more complex. These diagrams can get you a little closer as to what influences were happening at the time. But you have to kind of understand that when we're talking about American modernism, everything I've just said is Eurocentric linear narrative nonsense. See, academies and museums are constantly attempting to categorize and organize the complex happenings in art into simple stories. And of course, those academics and museums have historically been exclusively European white males. So a lot of the people and stories and cultures that exist in the world were left out. But this gives us a good knowledge base to start with, and from here we can work towards a broader and more inclusive understanding of painting. Alright, that was a lot. We hit up hundreds of years of the history of painting in minutes. We might have breezed over some things. We may have more questions. If there's anything you'd like to know, go ahead and hit up the discussion, or email me, or get a hold of me in any way you feel comfortable. Now, also, I need you to jump into Canvas and check out in the modules what I need you to do today. And again, if you have any questions, just let me know. All right? Take care, everybody.